Bienvenue au podcast de l'Association végétarienne de Montréal, présenté par Jean-Charles Concasse.
Hello Brenda.
Hello.
It's nice to have you on an interview.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yes, I really enjoyed the Toronto fair. It's really nice to be here.
Oh, we're so glad you guys made it this year.
So I'm gonna asking to every person I interview. So how did you become a vegan? How did you choose this path?
It's kind of interesting. I was a public health nutritionist, a registered dietitian, for a few years before I started on this path, and my whole training was Canada's Food Guide and the 4 food groups and meat, and the meat was one of the 4 food groups, and so a lot of people would wonder. I didn't actually even know a real live vegetarian. I'd never met a vegetarian dietitian, so I often get asked, well, how on earth did you end up making that switch? And for me, it was a very gradual transition towards a more healthful diet. So I was going more and more, I was learning to eat lentils and tofu and all of these things, and like them. And as I increased those things, the other things, of course, started to decrease. But the difference between someone that eats a largely plant-based diet and somebody that's an ethical, committed vegan is there's something that happens. And for me, what happened was it's a funny story, but I had a friend who's a hunter, a deer hunter, and he was on his way deer hunting, and he stopped by my home just for a little visit. And I remember on his way over, as he was driving over, I was trying to think of how I could make him feel guilty enough about killing a deer so that he wouldn't kill it. And so I said to him, I don't understand how you could feel good about taking a big gun in the woods and shooting such a beautiful, innocent animal. And the animal doesn't even have defense. It's not, some people say hunting is like a sport. And I said, I don't think it's a sport. I think a sport is where both teams have the same equipment. And this deer has no gun to shoot back. It's not fair. And what he said to me really is what put me over the edge. Because he said to me, Brenda, just because you don't have the guts to pull the trigger does not mean you are not responsible for the trigger being pulled every time you buy a piece of meat that's camouflaged in cellophane in a grocery store. He said, you just pay someone to do the dirty work for you. And he said, at least the animals I eat have had a life. I doubt very much you can say the same for the ones that are sitting on your plate. And it was a shock, because it was the first time anybody had ever really forced me to take responsibility for the food that I was eating. And so I thought to myself, he's absolutely right. And so what I did was I went into a number of stores, I bought some books, and I tried to get informed about the current system of animal agriculture. And I was absolutely mortified by what I found. It's not like it was when my mom grew up on a farm 60 years ago. Today, most animals are raised in confined, sort of what we call factory farms. And what goes on there is not something I think anybody with a conscience could approve of. It is just beyond despicable. And so I thought, I absolutely can't have anything to do with that anymore. So I was determined that I would remain a registered dietitian, but figure out a way to put together a truly vegan diet that's exceptionally healthy. And so for me, the transition itself was really not that difficult. We had substitutes for so many things. There's soy milk instead of regular milk, and we replaced meat with legumes and tofu, and I like food, and so if food tastes good and you have enough of it to eat, it's just not a problem. And to me, the comparing what the animals go through with my desire to have tasty food. There's no competition there. I can have very tasty food without causing that kind of pain and suffering. So that's my story there.
Yeah, excellent. And what's the current mistake people make when becoming a vegan or a raw foodist? Is it the same or what's...
A little different. I think with a vegan, the most common mistake is switching from meat and potatoes to pasta and bagels and all of these familiar foods that are comfortable but not very nutritious. And so it's really important, you know, it's especially young people, they'll instead of having a burger and fries, they'll have just the fries. And that's a big mistake. We need to replace the meat with foods that provide good protein and iron and zinc, like beans and tofu and things like that. We need to replace the milk with things that are rich in calcium, like the dark greens and the fortified non-dairy milks. And so that's the trick, and people really need to be conscious of not just eliminating meat and eliminating dairy, but finding appropriate replacements. And then in the raw food world, the most common mistake is ignoring some of the real key nutrients that just aren't present in plant foods, like, for example, vitamin B12. They just think, oh, we'll make enough of it in our body, and we really don't. And almost all the studies, well, I shouldn't say almost all, every study I've ever seen on raw food vegans, the B12 levels are dismal. They are grossly deficient. And so unless they're using a supplement, so that's really important. So B12, and then with raw food people sometimes use very high fat, a lot of coconut oil, a lot of olive oil, and it dilutes the nutritional density of the diet. So nutrients, meeting nutritional requirements like protein, iron, and zinc especially, become even a little bit more difficult. A lot of raw foodists won't eat legumes at all, for example, and I think a good compromise is to do a mainly raw food diet and have some lentil soup or something like that to get the legumes in, or they can sprout some of the legumes as well. So those are some of the things that I see.
What about protein? We know right now that animal protein is bad, especially in excess. What about plant-based protein? Is it the same thing or?
It's not the same thing. I wouldn't say they're the same thing. The plant-based protein doesn't come packaged with what animal-based protein is packaged with. The saturated fat, the cholesterol, a lot of the advanced glycation end products and heterocyclic amines and all of these things that often come with cooking animal protein foods. With plant-based protein foods, first of all, you just don't get the saturated fat. You don't get any cholesterol. All of those things are absent, but also the amino acid profiles and so on really aren't that much different. When you consume a variety of plant-based foods, it's not that much different than animal-based foods. The other big difference is the animal-based protein it's more of an acid-forming food as compared to the plant-based foods, which are more alkaline-forming generally. And so there's a difference there. There's a difference in the amount of calcium that will be excreted from the body with a more acid-forming diet. So definitely there's a difference there. And so consuming excessive animal protein will tend to do more damage than consuming excessive plant-based protein. But it's actually really hard to consume excessive plant-based protein because all of the protein foods in the plant kingdom come with some carbohydrate and some fat, whereas the animal-based foods are just protein and fat. And so it's easier to overdo the protein in an animal-based diet than in a plant-based diet. Even if you eat a fair bit of legumes and so forth, your total protein intake still won't be excessive. The only way you'll ever do excessive protein on a plant-based diet is if you use a lot of these concentrated protein powders. Yeah, and in that case you can possibly be overdoing it somewhat. But for most people, they're not going to be drinking gallons of this stuff. They might have one smoothie with a scoop of Vega, which is a wonderful choice. But you know that is reasonable. It's not going to be excessive.
Is there some vegetable that we shouldn't eat raw, actually?
Well, it's interesting, not a lot, but there are some that probably we should minimize, and I'll just tell you briefly what they are. First, there's actually a substance in mushrooms that they're called hydrazines, and the main one being agaritin, which is a possible carcinogen. Cooking completely destroys it generally. Soaking, dehydrating reduces it, but not by a lot. It's not that you should never ever eat raw mushrooms, but they shouldn't be a huge part of your diet, and you shouldn't be eating them in large quantity. So I would go lightly on that. The other thing is a couple of other things. One is buckwheat greens, which some people put in their green juices, and buckwheat greens contain phagopyrin, which is something that is a reddish pigment that causes photosensitivity in people and in animals, very, very commonly. And so you really shouldn't consume that on a regular basis. If you have a green juice once in a blue moon that has some, it's not a huge issue, but definitely not as a regular feature in your diet. Alfalfa sprouts, certainly you can eat them, but you don't want to eat 2 cups a day, especially if you have lupus, because they contain cannabinine, which can substitute for one of our regular proteins when we're building proteins in our body, and that can exacerbate symptoms of lupus. So that's probably another one. The other thing is you have to be careful with legumes, beans. Beans, any kind of beans, but especially the larger beans. The mung beans, the peas, and the lentils are okay. But and sprouted, you can sprout them. But a lot of the other beans, probably better to cook them because they contain hemagglutinins and some trypsin inhibitors that are destroyed by cooking, but not as much by sprouting. So those things you might want to be cautious about as well. Otherwise, not too many problems.
Okay, so mostly it's positive and
yeah, very, very positive.
Okay.
Yes.
So I would like to thank you for the interview. It was a pleasure to make an interview with you, and I hope you enjoy your stay in Toronto.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. That was fun. Thank you.